So, if we begin at the beginning, I was born in a small town called Bideford in the county of Devon, in the southwest of England, in what we call the West Country of England. And I was born in the year 1925 on the 25th of February. As it turned out later, that date was rather useful, rather important to me. We shall come to that a little bit later. My father at that stage was the secretary to a small shipping company, and this company operated coastal vessels, and Bideford was, and still is in fact, a small port. It's not actually on the coast, it's a few miles back from the coast on the River Torridge, and it has therefore sheltered waters from the Atlantic Ocean, which of course can be very stormy sea. These boats used to bring in cargoes of coal, and they would take out some of the local clay and other materials. And that was quite a nice little job that my father had at that time. I suppose that you could say that we were in the sort of lower middle class sort of status in society. We had a comfortable life, although we lived when I was born certainly, we lived in a small cottage which my parents owned, but which had no running water indoors and had no gas or even electricity. A little bit later we had these things, but not at that stage, not at that early stage in 1925. In 1932, my father was appointed secretary and eventually director of another company, but this time in South Devon, in the town of Teignmouth, T-E-I-G-N. All sorts of pronunciations of this little town, as a matter of fact. When events occurred in the town, occasionally it would be on the national news. When we had a flood, for example, it would be invariably referred to as Teignmouth, or Teignmouth, but in fact the local people called it Teignmouth. And I spent, I was seven years old when we moved. My sister, only other sibling, was 2 years old. And so we made this, what was at the time, big move, in fact, over a distance of 70 miles from the north coast of Devonshire to the south coast of Devonshire. And we then, I settled down at school, of course, and then eventually was able to go to the local grammar school, Teignmouth Grammar School, where I spent a very happy time, in fact. I wasn't especially keen on work at that stage, but I enjoyed myself very much. We had, in fact, it was one of the few co-ed schools in the country, and we had a senior master who was a Welshman, a man called Thomas, and he was a very lively character. He'd served in the First World War, in fact had been seriously injured, but as a Welshman he was very keen on cultural activities, and he organised every year what he and we all called an Eisteddfod, the local competitions, so to speak, the national competitions in Wales referred to as Eisteddfod. And we had this in our school, which was probably unique in a school in England at that time. And so we had the opportunity of engaging in all sorts of activities, writing poems and staging one-act plays. We had, in fact, 3 houses. The houses were named after the local rivers, the Teign, the Dart and the Exe. I and my sister were both in the house called Teign. And so we had competitions between these houses. And the whole Eisteddfod, in fact, culminated in the 3 one-act plays that were performed by the pupils, organised by the pupils, And the staff would judge the competitions, but they wouldn't take part in any of the organisation. I think that was an excellent idea. It's very good. It's the kind of thing perhaps that you now take for granted, but in those days it was quite exceptional. We had a very relaxed atmosphere in the school also. This was another thing that I look back on with pleasure. But of course, in those days, it wasn't a great problem of discipline. And so our headmaster, every so often, a man called Silverstone, every so often would give us some sort of pep talk and tell us that something was going a little bit wrong and so on. But there were no serious events in my time. Nothing that I can look back on and feel collectively that we were ashamed about, so to speak. Now, the thing that did happen, of course, was that World War II broke out in Britain in 1939. And that was right in the middle of my period at school. I was then at the age of 14. I was, of course, perfectly aware of what was happening. And it was, of course, a tremendous change in our way of life. There's no doubt at all about that. It was a great upheaval in many respects, and yet in other ways I think it really did bring out the best in us, in the sense that we had a shared sense of danger, of purpose, of collective activity. And in a way, actually, we enjoyed that. I must say that, in spite of all the dangers. I remember seeing my first German bomber, in fact, in 1940. And this plane circled over the town. I was on my bicycle with a friend. We used to do a lot of cycling, of course, in those days, because there were very few motor cars on the roads. And we were in the middle of the town, and we saw this aeroplane, a twin-engined plane, which I later identified as a Junkers 88. And this circled around, and then it did a shallow dive, just a little dive, not like a dive bomber, but just a little dive, and we saw two objects coming out of this plane. And these two objects were bombs, of course. Now, fortunately, we weren't close enough to be hurt by the bombs, but we were certainly scared, no question about that. And we immediately went down on the ground, of course. We went flat, and there was a certain amount of commotion around us, and that was our first taste of air raids. Later on, we had a lot more activity, and some of that was very unpleasant. On one evening, for example, my parents and I were at home, Sunday evening actually, and we were listening to the radio. This was, well, the wireless, as we called it in those days, before the time of television, of course. And we heard a plane coming overhead, and suddenly, there was no air raid warning at that point at all, and suddenly we heard the bombs dropping, one after another, a stick of bombs, which went across our street, and the house diagonally opposite to ours was completely demolished, and we were thrown onto the floor. In fact, a tremendous shock of wave, of course. We had debris coming through our roof. Our windows were blown in at the front of the house. We were sitting at the back, fortunately. Something came, we never knew what it was, but probably a brick or something like that came through and landed on my sister's bed. She wasn't there at the time, fortunately. And my father and I rushed outside, and the first thing I noticed, well, two things really. One was the smell of brick dust. The air was thick with this brick dust. And the other thing were the gas flares that were going up around us. The gas mains had been hit. And we looked across the road, and the house that was there, friends that we knew, of course, had been completely demolished, collapsed. There was a gaping hole, and wreckage thrown all around the street. That was our first bad taste of bombing. And after that, I won't go into great details, but we had, just to mention one or two other things about this, we had what we called the tip and run raids, when the German fighter bombers would come low over the water underneath the radar beam, and therefore would escape detection until they came over their target, and then the raid would probably somewhere between could be between 3 and 10 of these fighter bombers would come over at a time, and they would drop their bombs and fire their guns, and then they would return and go back across the channel again to France, their bases in France, and at that stage our air raid warning would go as the planes were returning over the sea. And on one occasion when this happened, I was standing on the sea front and looking out to sea, just looking around idly, and again I was with the same friend, and we were just strolling along the front. We didn't have our bicycles with us on that occasion, and suddenly we both spotted some objects appeared to be coming straight at us over the water, and these were the Messerschmitt 109 fighter bombers. And it was a very strange experience because one felt almost like Rabbit and the Stoat, watching these planes coming. It seemed to be several seconds at least before we could move, and then we, of course, obviously we dived for cover. And again, we weren't very close, fortunately, but the noise was deafening because at that stage, 1942, we did have some guns. In the first place, we had no defences at all. At that stage, we had things called Bofors guns, and these were firing at the planes were firing, dropping the bombs, trying to hit the port and the railway line. And there was a tremendous noise which lasted just perhaps for 30 seconds or something like that, and then they went. And then on another occasion, perhaps I mentioned briefly two other experiences of this kind. We were in a cinema on one occasion, watching a film a crazy film called Hells of Poppin'. And everything was seemed to be normal until suddenly we heard bangs outside, and holes started appearing in the roof of the cinema. Now these were bullets, presumably, coming through into the cinema. Fortunately, no one was actually hurt, but there was absolute panic, as you can imagine, in the cinema, because again we had no warning. And then on another occasion, we were holding a party at our school in the evening, and we'd been very careful about the blackout, but the all clear, as we called it, had sounded, so planes apparently left, and there was a little bit of relaxation. We must have opened the windows and so on, and a single plane, never knew what it was, but a single plane came back, circled around and came back, and dropped bombs in our school ground. And again the windows were blown in. A few people were cut, but nothing very serious. But our parents, of course, were then very worried because they had heard there was some incident at the school, so they came up, were very obviously very relieved that we were all safe and sound. Well, in 1942, at the age of 17, I'd completed my school education, completed my time in what we called the sixth form of our school, and I'd done sufficiently well, not brilliantly by any means, but sufficiently well to qualify for university place. And my parents and I talked about this and whether I should go to London University, and we decided that perhaps it would be advisable, because of the heavy raids on London, that I should attend our local university college, as it was then, not a full university, but a university college at Exeter. And this was, as it turned out, for me, a very good decision. And so I attended, I accepted the place at Exeter, and I was lucky again to be able to stay, although the city of Exeter was only 15 miles away from our little town. I was lucky enough to be given a place in the Hall of Residence, so I stayed in Exeter, lived in Exeter, and was able, therefore, to start my university education. And that was very lucky, because I mentioned earlier that the year I was born, 1925, and the month was February. Now, in wartime, we had a privilege in the sense that as science students we were able to attend university, but we were obliged to complete our degree, if at all possible, by the age of 20 years and 4 months. For some reason, I don't know why that was selected. That was the instruction. So one had to complete one's studies. Now, if it was not possible to obtain a degree, then you had to go off and fight and come back afterwards to complete your studies. Now, because I was young, I must have been youngest member, I suppose, in my group of students, and I was therefore given the opportunity to spend the 3 years and undertake the 3-year course. Some of my fellow students had to leave earlier, and that meant that in my case I was able to stay until 1945, when the year ended. Also, because I had the opportunity to take the full 3-year course, that gave me, of course, a good chance of gaining a good degree. And so I graduated with, as it turned out, fortunately, a first-class honours degree in chemistry in 1945. Now, that degree was awarded by the University of London, because Exeter at that stage did not have the permission to grant its own degrees. So we took what were called external London degrees. So we had to go to London, for example, to take our practical examinations. Practical examinations were quite tough, actually. We had 2 full days of practical examinations at London University, at Imperial College, and that was quite a thing to tackle. Apart from anything else, it meant a good deal of stamina, of course, to stay in the laboratory without leaving the lab for 7 hours at a time. And we had, the safety precautions were almost non-existent then, in those days, so we were able to consume our sandwiches and have our coffee or our lemonade and so on in the lab. With no question of any protection for eyes, or we had liberal use of hydrogen sulfide, of course, of H2S, and all the rest of it. And so all those conditions were very primitive, but we had to undertake these analyses, the 6 radical mixture, inorganic mixture analysis, and then the organic identification of an organic compound, and then the synthesis of another compound. So it was quite a severe test, actually. And on our first theory paper, I remember, we had, there were 6 questions on the paper, and in fact, one had to, if possible, attempt those 6 questions. There was no choice. And so that again was quite amusing. And I was lucky, actually, extremely lucky when I remember, because one of the questions concerned some inorganic compounds. I can't remember what they were now, but anyway, they were inorganic compounds which I'd actually been reading about just by chance in the Journal of the Chemical Society. And I'd made a note of, I noted, we couldn't take notes into the exam, of course, but I mentally noted that there were differences, significant differences in their dipole moments. And so I quoted this, and that seemed to be, of course, acceptable. And I remember on the essay paper we had to write 2 essays within a period of 3 hours, so it meant 1.5 hours per essay. And one of these, which gave me a nice chance, was on resonance, as it was called in the old days. And I had an interest in reading about resonance, and so I wrote about that at some length. And it was all, of course, a matter of chance, whether you had spotted the right questions but in my case I was lucky. Well, I'd then completed my first degree, and I then had to think carefully about what I should do after that. Now, there was an organization called the Joint Recruiting Board, and this organization was responsible for making sure that all graduates were directed into some useful work, war work, of course, during the war, or some related activities just after the war. As a matter of interest, one of the members of that Joint Recruiting Board, the JRB as we called them, was the author C.P. Snow. And I was interviewed by Snow at one point. I don't remember very much about the interview. It was just a straightforward thing. He asked me what I was interested in, what I would like to do. And I went for an interview, for example, to the Admiralty Research Laboratories. And that was one of the possibilities that I had, job that I had. Much later, instead, when I met Snow again, I reminded him, of course he didn't remember me at that point at all, but he said that it was quite an interesting job that he had in going from one university to another, meeting a lot of young men and trying to decide their fate. Well, I'd been for a few interviews, again trying to receive some offers of employment, trying to make up my mind what to do. And then out of the blue, Dr. John Gregg came. Now, he'd been one of my lecturers during my undergraduate period. And John Gregg came along, turned up at our house. He actually came back from a camping holiday at the time. He was camping on Dartmoor, and as soon as he heard the result of the examinations, he then knew that I was eligible to undertake research, because at that time you had to obtain a first-class honours degree. And so he realized that I was qualified. He had research studentship, the first one, in fact, at Exeter available. And so he came specially to ask me whether I would like to take this studentship. And of course I accepted it with great pleasure. And so that was the beginning, in fact, of our long association, which is still going strong, I'm pleased to say. I'll come back and say something more about that later. And so I had the opportunity to work with Greg on my PhD project. Now, the PhD project was concerned the thermal decomposition of gibbsite, aluminium hydroxide, and the use of adsorption techniques. Greg already had what we called the Gregg balance, which he'd constructed, glass balance, for measurements of organic and water vapor adsorption. And so I was given the opportunity of starting to use that. And he also had a primitive heat of immersion calorimeter, which I also started to use. Needless to say, those pieces of apparatus didn't work very well. And so I had to do a lot of improvement of glass blowing, which is very good training, I must say, in those days. And then I decided I'd improve the Gregg balance. That was made operational. We used that to obtain isotherms, adsorption isotherms of carbon tetrachloride. We tried to make adsorption isotherms of water vapor, but it turned out that this was an extremely difficult system to study. Later on, we've studied the absorption of water in great detail, so we know much more about it now. But at that stage, we didn't realize how complicated these systems are, the fact that one has a whole number of different irreversible changes taking place, and so on. So that part wasn't very successful. But anyway, we made the balance work, and we obtained some good isotherms of carbon tetrachloride, which we published, in fact. And I also decided that I should construct myself a volumetric apparatus. And what I did was to make, first of all, big air thermostat, big cabinet, in which I could get inside, in fact. And this cabinet had electrical wiring all around the inside, around the walls, and was maintained at reasonably constant temperature, within about plus minus a degree, I suppose, something of that order, which was sufficient. And then I constructed the volumetric equipment inside this cabinet. Looking back, I realized just how dangerous that was, because the electrical wiring, first of all, was completely exposed. If I touched, as I did sometimes, one wire, that was all right. It gave me a little tingling sensation. But I'm afraid every so often I would forget myself and reach across from one side of the cabinet to the other, and then I would find myself receiving quite a hefty shock. On one occasion I even found myself sitting on the floor. That was dangerous. I shuddered to think about it. The other thing that was dangerous about this was that I was glass blowing inside this cabinet with pools of mercury all over the place. And when one had to repair, as frequently happened, there would be a breakage of one part, and one had to reseal the glass, and the mercury was there, so you were heating up the mercury at the same time as glass blowing, and that must have been terrible, really. But anyway, we survived it. We had to use, in the first place, first volumetric measurements I made, in fact, were of nitrous oxide, because we could get the nitrous oxide, medical supplies, and I made those measurements at minus 78 Celsius CO2 temperature, because I was able to go out on my bicycle and bring back solid carbon dioxide from some of the local ice cream producers in the town, in the city of Exeter. So I brought back the solid CO2 in sufficient quantity to provide a kind of cryostat bath, solid CO2, mix it up with ethanol or something like that to give a slush bath, in fact. And that was used for the measurement of the nitrous oxide absorption. And then of course, we'd read at that stage about the work of BUT, of Brunara, Emmett and Teller, and that was in the fashion. It was fairly new, and of course I realized that I would have to make measurements at lower temperature. And so then the problem arose: how do we get something which would take us down to a lower temperature? Now, for some reason, it was impossible to get liquid nitrogen delivered. And the best we could get, in fact, was liquid oxygen, which gave us a temperature of minus 183 degrees Celsius. So we had this sent down from London. I had to go down to the railway station to pick it up, which I did, and I collected it in a glass jar, brought it back to the lab, and then used it, and again, and this was a crazy situation really, used it with asbestos and cotton wool and so on in the neck of the vessel. I mean, this would be completely forbidden nowadays, and I don't think Greg either, to be fair, had any idea of the dangers attached to doing this. And fortunately, we didn't have any Bunsen burners or anything like that close enough to present a real danger, but there was a potential hazard there without any doubt. So I finished that project in 1948. We published 3 papers as a result of that work in the old journal the Journal of Physical and Colloid Chemistry, I think it was called, which predated the Journal of Colloid and Interface Science. Now, in my final year, our professor was a man called Britton, Professor H.T.S. Britton, who was often referred to as the hydrogen ion king, because he'd written a book on hydrogen ions. He was an electrochemist, a very nice man, in fact. And we had just had one professor in the department. Greg was a reader in physical chemistry, but not a full professor. And one day Britton came into my lab and he said, I've got someone coming from ICI next week and I'd like you to meet him. This was a Dr. Faulkner. And this chap came into my research lab and we had quite a long chat. He wanted to know what I was doing. So I told him about the project, which it was going and so on. And he said, I'd like you to come up to Billingham to meet some of my colleagues. And so I thought that was a marvellous idea because I knew a little bit about the work there. There was some very interesting catalysis work being done in the ICI labs at Billingham. There were several well-known people there. Dennis Dowden was perhaps the best known of the industrial chemists at Billingham. And so I gladly accepted that invitation. Now what I didn't know at the time was, I was so naive that I didn't realise that this was a recruiting invitation. And so I spent 3 days at the ICI expense, staying in a place called Norton Hall, which was a magnificent establishment. But of course the factory in those days was pretty horrific actually. Anyway, I spent the 3 days and had some very interesting discussions. I met Dowden and others. And at the end of the 3 days, one of the senior people said to me, well, if you want to join us, we can offer you a job. And I had to think very quickly. And I thought, well, there's an invitation. That's something that would be nice to at least to gain some experience of industry. And so I accepted the offer. And I only stayed actually at Billingham for a year, but it was a very enjoyable time, and it was a very useful time for me, as it turned out. Enjoyable because, well, I met my wife there. She was also working in the lab, and so that was one thing that came out of it. And the other thing was that it gave me actually several ideas for research. One project that I was concerned with, we were working in the early days of chromatography, and we used to receive silica gel from another ICI lab. And these batches weren't reliable. Every so often we would find a batch that just wouldn't give us good results at all in the separation. In fact, we were involved in those days with, interesting enough, with Fischer-Tropsch products, separations. And these were quite difficult, of course, to achieve cleanly. And so we needed to have some really good quality silica gel. But unfortunately, the colleagues in the other lab at Blakely, ICI Blakely, would never reveal exactly how they prepared their silica gel. And so I realized that this was quite tricky, and there was the opportunity for some academic work. And also, of course, I had the opportunity of looking at other areas of catalysis, oxidation catalysis and so on. I realized the importance of surface properties of oxidation catalysts like chromium, for example. So those were things that really experience that I could only get in working for this short period of time in industry. Now, I had made up my mind that I would return to the academic world, and I wondered how best to achieve that. So I made applications to 3 academic establishments. I didn't actually have the confidence to apply to any of the established universities at that stage, but I applied to 3 quite well-known technical colleges, as they were called. One was a local college at Middlesbrough. It was called the Constantine College. Another was a college in the Lancashire town of Wigan, where there was a lot of London external degree work being done, so they were fairly well known also. And then the third one was at the Royal Technical College, Salford. And again, as luck would have it for me, the offer came from Salford first. An interview, I was invited to go to Salford for an interview, and I was offered a post of lecturer in physical chemistry, and I took it. And that meant moving from one side of the industrial north of England to the other side. So at Billingham, I've been on the east coast, north of England, and I then moved across to the western side to the Manchester area. Salford is a kind of satellite town, very close to Manchester. And without knowing really very much about the opportunities, but it was a good move as it turned out. Although I dropped in salary, I remember my salary was decreased from the princely sum of £500 a year to £400 a year. So that was a significant decrease in salary. But by that stage, Ruby, my wife, we weren't married, but she was quite keen that I made the move, and so she supported the move. And she joined me then shortly afterwards. But at the time, it was a difficult decision to make, but it was one that I took, and I was very glad about it later. Because what I didn't realize when I accepted the post was that this particular college was fortunate in having a principal, a man called Venables, Peter Venables, who later became Sir Peter Venables and became Vice Chancellor of another upgraded college. And he, in fact, was far-sighted, very keen on technological education, and was determined to get the place to achieve improvements, to improve the status of the college, which he did actually very successfully. Well, one of the things I remember was that he proudly told us that Salford itself was a rather poor city, working class city essentially, and what he did was to obtain a major part of the local authority grant, as it was called, from the county of Lancashire. And so the Salford contribution was really quite small, and then the rest, most of the money then also came from central funding from the government. And that was a very clever move. Another thing that was good about Salford was that we had several important industrial estates very close to us, including the estate of Trafford Park, as it was called, a big engineering estate close to Manchester, and we had the big ICI dyestuffs factory also at Blakely, and a number of other smaller companies were around. Oil companies were close to us also, not very far away. So it gave us a good chance to get support from industry. And so I took this opportunity and went out with my begging bowl, so to speak, and obtained quite quickly, managed to get grants from two companies in particular. One was a branch of Unilever, Joseph Crossfield Company, who were the producers of silica gel, and I convinced them that I had this little bit of experience of working with silica gel and that I could probably do something to improve the quality of their material. So they gave me a studentship for that. And the other company was one that I'd known before from my student days. They were producers of alumina, a firm called Peter Spence, who later became part of the Laporte group of companies. They produced high quality aluminas for adsorbent purposes and catalyst aluminas, catalyst supports. And so they also provided me with funding. And that enables us to make a start. And so, in spite of a very heavy teaching load, in fact we had something like 30 hours teaching a week, and some of that would be in the evening, in fact. Saturday morning work as well, of course. And we had to move around. I remember teaching in all sorts of strange establishments outside the main building of the college. We had the use of accommodation in some of the church halls, for example, that were extremely cold in the winter time. And we would move along what was once quite an elegant crescent at Salford, overlooking the river Irwell, which at that time was a appalling sight with a thick foam on it. All the industrial pollution that you could think about coming into this Irwell River. Anyway, the crescent, as the name suggests, was a long crescent with early 19th century buildings. Had been very elegant, but were now blackened, completely covered with black deposit, sooty deposit. And I remember I had to go in one morning of the week. I started at one end of the crescent in a Unitarian church and finished up at the end of the morning in a Methodist church at the other end of the crescent, so many 100 yards around the crescent. And that was the sort of way in which we had to work. And of course we had to do all our own glass blowing again. My students, two research students in those days, Michael Harris was one, and John Madeley was another, both now retired. But they were first class, they were very good people. And another good thing about teaching there was that there were ex-servicemen coming back after the war, returning, who were determined to work pretty hard. And I remember in 1 year, we, out of a group of 10 ex-servicemen, 4 of these 10 obtained first-class honours degrees, which was really a remarkable achievement. It was very gratifying to be able to teach people of that calibre and also of such great enthusiasm. I should have said perhaps that if I gave the impression that I was completely exempt from military activities, that was wrong, because during the war we did have, whilst I was an undergraduate student, we did have to undertake military training ourselves, and that again was not an altogether unpleasant experience, as a matter of fact. As looking back, we had to spend part of Saturdays and part of Sunday mornings on military training, and that involved also map reading, cross-country work, and of course shooting as well, bayonet practice and so on, all these things that were part of the training in those days. And I actually obtained my 2 officers' certificates, A and B, at the time, so I was qualified to become an officer. Never had to, because the war finished, fortunately, but at least I did get to that level, rose to the rank of sergeant also. So there we are. Well, now coming back then to my period at Salford, this was my experience as a teacher and as a research manager in a small way, if you like, and it started it was a good start really for my professional career. I stayed at Salford until 1956, and then I was given the chance, my invitation, going to another college at Liverpool. Now, the invitation came because my head of department at Salford, who was a man called Edwards, who actually died last year, as it happened, had been appointed the principal at this college. And he must have thought that I would make a reasonable head of department, so he invited me to join him, move with him to Liverpool, which meant just a distance of about 40 miles going from the Manchester area to Liverpool, which was closer, of course, to the coast on the River Mersey. And so I became head of the Department of Chemistry and Biology, as it was called in those days, at the Liverpool College of Technology. And I stayed there from 1956 until 1965, when I moved to Brunel. That period at Salford, at Liverpool, was again a good one for me. We were able then to appoint, it was quite a small staff establishment in chemistry and biology when I arrived at Liverpool, but it was just at the time when technical education was taking off in Britain. therefore I had the chance to appoint a number of new staff to my department. And I managed to get hold of some very good people. So we created quite a nice, friendly group of academic staff, and we have achieved a certain national reputation, I think, as a result of that. We ran one of the first diploma in technology courses in chemistry, for example. That seemed to be a sort of something that people talked about and was widely acknowledged locally. And we also had the encouragement from Edwards, the principal, to develop our research activities. And so at that time I managed to work with other members of staff. We had various projects in surface and solid state chemistry, and things were going quite well, in fact. But I felt that the opportunities perhaps were just a little bit limited because we didn't have university status, and there wasn't any immediate prospect of that at Liverpool. And out of the blue, Edwards himself had moved actually to another college which became university. That was Bradford College, became University of Bradford. He was given the opportunity of becoming the first Vice-Chancellor at Bradford. And so he moved there. Venables had left Salford and he'd become the Vice-Chancellor, head of another university at Aston. And I suppose that they both felt that I had some talent or had something going for me, and so they suggested that I should take a post at Brunel. Brunel College, again, was one of the senior technical colleges in Britain, and following a report by the Robbins Committee in the 1960s, the early 1960s, Brunel and Bradford and Salford and a few other colleges, these senior colleges, were designated as potential universities. And I received this invitation to go to Brunel, knowing that Brunel had the chance, and the likelihood, in fact, at that stage, of becoming a university. And things were all set in motion. And so I really felt, and Ruby agreed with me, that this was an opportunity that we couldn't miss. It meant moving from the north of England to the London area, and we both had mixed feelings about that, actually. We weren't over keen to go to London, because we knew that things would be more expensive, and life would be perhaps a little more difficult in some ways. Our children were young at that stage, but anyway, we thought, well, it would be wrong to turn down the chance of taking this job as the head of department, chairman, and first professor of chemistry at Brunel. And so in 1965, we moved. I moved to this position at Brunel. We moved then to a house in Buckinghamshire. We had to pay a lot more money for that house, of course, because it was in the London area. I had to drive a distance, 20 miles to the university, whereas in Liverpool the journey was much easier, and so on. So life became a little more complicated. But the opportunities, of course, on the other hand, were opened up for me. And that was a very good time, an exciting time to move in 1965. It couldn't have been better in a way, because the government then were keen to develop higher technological education. Brunel became one of the first technological universities in the country, and we were given special treatment. We had to accept all the rules of the game, of course. Becoming a university was not entirely straightforward in Britain. The established universities were cautious, in fact, about welcoming newcomers into their rather privileged fold. And so we had to go through the hoop. We had advisory committees watching us and so on. And for 3 years we were in a sort of kind of probationary period. But we came through that, and it was, in fact, a very interesting and exciting time, because grants were not too difficult to get. If one had some ideas, you could apply to the government for the Science Research Council, as it was then, for funding. This wasn't at all difficult, and they gave you equipment for apparatus, funding for students. ICI and other big companies would also provide fellowships, postdoctoral fellowships. At first, actually, strangely enough, ICI had a very paternalistic attitude towards this. And although they were quite generous in providing funding for these fellowships, they didn't really want any return, which was very strange. So they would, as it were, give you a paternalistic pat on the head and best wishes, and you were told to go away and play with that money. It all changed, of course. It changed a great deal after that. But that was the view in those early days. And so things were going very well. I was able to get together a good team. We worked to bring in people from other places. We had postdocs coming from other countries, from the United States, for example, from Australia, places like that. And so we were going well, and things were developing in a very nice way. And that lasted, I suppose, until the early 80s, or perhaps at the end of the 70s. One could see the beginnings of the problems arising, but certainly in the early 80s. The time when Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister was one where it was clear that there were problems, quite apart from the colour of the government, so to speak. There were problems anyway. But the Conservatives, of course, had clear ideas about saving money. And so they were determined to hold back the funding. And this was very difficult for some of the newer universities like Brunel. The older establishments, particularly Oxford and Cambridge, thought at first that they were immune from these government cuts. Later they realised that they weren't, actually. But at first they felt they were above all this, that some of us would have to pay the price because we'd been apparently favoured, and therefore we would have to accept the cuts that were coming along. And that's the way it seemed to work at first. For example, in Salford went through a terrible time. They had something like 30 to 40% cut in their funding, which was absolutely enormous. They had to lose a lot of their senior staff, were obliged to retire early or to accept redundancy money, and it was a very traumatic experience for them. Fortunately, they appointed a very good Vice-Chancellor who helped them to come through that experience. And now I think they're well established. But it was a very difficult time for all of us. At Brunel, we didn't suffer as badly as that. We had cuts of the order of something like between about 15%, I suppose, roughly speaking. But in my case, I was called to see our Vice-Chancellor on one occasion, and I was head of department, head of chemistry, and he said to me, well, very sorry, but you have a staff establishment of 21 in chemistry, and I'm afraid you will have to lose 3 posts. And now that is a devastating thing to hear, of course. And it made us, it presented enormous problems. I said, well, okay, perhaps I should resign myself. And he said, oh no, I'm not going to accept your resignation. So that was an easy solution. But as it turned out, we did come through it. Two of my colleagues accepted the opportunity to retire early. They thought that this was an opportunity because they had a reasonable handout of money, of course, to do that. And so they weren't too sorry about this. And then in another case, in fact, another member of staff wanted to move into a half-time employment, but he wanted to join my research group as a senior colleague, and so I managed to find funding for him to do that. And then he was also playing a very important part as a senior politician in local government. So it's a rather interesting combination. In fact, in his case, he did it very well. He was the chairman of the Berkshire County Council, a very important man who used to meet the Queen and so on, and then also a member of my research team. We published, his name was Kenneth, as a matter of fact, and we published some good papers together. So that was a challenge to us, and it was the beginning of this period which really has overtaken academics in Britain, and which has made life very difficult. I suppose, looking back, one could say that in the 1960s and 70s, probably life was too good. It was probably too easy for us at that stage. I think one has to say that now. But the change when it came was very hard, very traumatic. And now I must say I have a great deal of sympathy for young academics in Britain, because they now find it extremely difficult to obtain financial support. They're expected to play a big part in teaching. Teaching establishments have been reduced, and they are also expected to publish so many 3 or 4 papers a year, and they don't have the security, job security, that we enjoyed. In fact, in our case, when I was appointed university teacher, it was understood that I had that job until I retired, and unless I did something terrible. And it was tenure for my professional life until the age of 65. Now this is not the case, I'm afraid. So things have changed dramatically. Now, I'll talk a bit more about the research perhaps in a minute, but just to say something about my other professional activities, I've been lucky to combine my duties at university world with activities outside, extramural activities, I suppose we can call them. I was invited to join the IUPAC, and I became the chairman of the Coloured and Surface Chemistry Commission of the IUPAC. I enjoyed that work very much, and we published a number of, during my time, recommendations and characterization of adsorbents and catalysts. And that was a nice period, because it gave a nice opportunity, to meet people, scientists, in some cases distinguished scientists, from all over the world, of course. And it reinforced the idea that science is an international activity. It has no political frontiers. The fact that one can come together with communists and catalysts and capitalists can come together and work happily together and get to know each other quite well is, I think, something that is to be encouraged, it seems to me. And you realize that these people, of course, are decent and have all these sorts of feelings of worries, anxieties, and so on that you have. I was able to make several trips to the old Soviet Union. I got to know some distinguished Russian chemists very well. I didn't like the things that I saw in the Soviet Union. I was horrified to see some of the things there, but I had a great respect for the work that they were doing. Man, I suppose that I felt was in our particular field was the leader and the most distinguished of all the Soviet chemists I met was A.V. Kislov. I met him first in 1957, and when he made his first visit to Britain. And then he came back again in 1958, I remember, and again a couple of times in the 1960s. And then I spent a week or so in Moscow in 1965 and spent some time with him then. And again, a much longer period in 1968 when he was my host. Spent months, in fact, in Moscow in 1968. And then after that, several other times more recently. Kislov was a remarkable man in many respects. He had very large research groups both in the university in Lomonosov, State University in Moscow, and in the Academy of Sciences, Physical Chemistry Institute of the Academy of Science. And these two groups worked together on areas of adsorption, chromatography, characterization of materials, of surface properties. And I didn't actually know how many workers he had, but the total must have certainly exceeded 100 at one stage. Very great number. He published a tremendous number of papers. He told me once at that time it was over 800 papers. At the end, I think it was over 900 papers that he and his colleagues, which seems a bit ridiculous. In fact, it was. Too many, really. But at the same time, although work was duplicated, triplicated, and so on, in the usual Russian fashion, it didn't conceal the good quality. This was the thing about it. So it's very good material, even though it was published over and over again. Same results you could see coming up in a whole number of different papers. But it was good quality research. That was the important thing about it. And he had the ability to lead this enormous team of people and had very clear ideas of what they should do. He developed, for example, when I met him first, he attended a Congress of Surface Activity, as it was called, in London. And he gave, I think, 3 or 4 papers in the session on the gas-solid interface. And his contributions were really reckoned by everyone, I think, who attended that meeting, to be way above anything else that we heard at that time. What really was extraordinary, the new information that was coming through from his laboratory, information on the effects of specificity and physical absorption, the effects of porosity, pore narrowing, the features of capillary condensation and so on. All this was shown in a very systematic sort of way. And these ideas were developed subsequently, along with his theories of gas chromatography, the calorimetric data, which they developed also, and so on. So that was very impressive. I also met academician Dubinin, who was a much more powerful figure than Kislov, but was not, in my view, in my view, he was not such a great scientist as Kislov. Dubinin, however, was well known for the concept of micropore filling. He published a review article in, I think that it was a quarterly review of the Chemical Society in 1953, which I read. And so we got to know a little bit about his work then. And then I met him briefly in 1965, and then I've met him on a number of occasions more recently. he died about 2 years ago. Kieslov died some time ago, I'm afraid, in 1984, I think, no, 1984 or 1986, mid-1980s anyway. So I got to know both of those people, and I could see the differences between them. Dubinin, very powerful figure, academician, general in the Red Army, and Kieslov, on the other hand, distinguished scientist, very well known outside the old Soviet Union, but someone who had enormous difficulties because he, as far as I know, was not a party member, and he came from an old Russian family. His flat, his apartment in Moscow, was remarkable in many respects in the university, because he had such a number of relics from the past, all sorts of fine things, objets d'art, one might say, collection of porcelain, of clocks, and all sorts of things like this that he'd managed to keep. And I think probably many of those came from the family, the old family. And this may well have been held against him. But the real problem was the conflict between Kieslov and Dubinin. This was the real problem. These two were, I realized in 1965, even as early as that they were not in sympathy with each other. And it came out much more clearly when I was there in 1968. I spent much more time with Kieslov and with Dubinin in 1968. And on one occasion, I was invited to Dubinin's office one morning, which was a little bit of a surprise actually, because by that stage he knew that I was friendly with Kieslov, and I was in sympathy with the work that Kieslov was doing. Anyway, I received the invitation to join Dubinin. I had no idea how the day was going to, well, whether it was just a half an hour's discussion or what would happen. Anyway, we had to talk for about perhaps an hour, no more than an hour, on scientific affairs. And after that, he then proceeded to produce some coffee and some vodka, and and a camera, took my picture and so on. And I thought, well, this is going to wrap it up, this is towards the end of the morning and so on. And then he said, well, very shortly my chauffeur-driven car will arrive, and we should be taken to the academician's restaurant. So the car turned up, one of these enormous Russian cars, and a black limousine of some sort. And we went out to the academician's restaurant, where we remained for the whole of the afternoon, consuming enormous lunch. Very privileged, of course, place to be in those days. And at the end of that, when we both, I think, consumed far too much alcohol, he then said, well, now, before you go, I want to buy you a few things to take back for your wife and children. So then we went to a special shop where he bought dolls and things and something for my wife. And at the end of all that, I went back to Kieslov's office, and he said, well, how did you get on with Dubinin? And I said, well, we spent a very agreeable time together, but I'm afraid we didn't talk much science. And he said, I knew that would happen. I knew exactly what would happen. But then, a little later, on that time, when I was there, we went to the Bolshoi together, Kieslov and I, by ourselves. And on that occasion, he really told me something about the problems that he had. He said that they were going to have an all-union absorption conference, and that he knew that this was going to be big trouble between the two groups because they weren't in agreement. And the science became a political issue. This was the problem. And I think Dubinin was rather jealous of Kieslov's status in the West. And so when we came to run a Faraday discussion, one of these important Faraday discussions, which we had the opportunity to do at Brunel in 1971, discussion on oxides, Geoffrey Parfitt and I, who were the organisers, we felt, well, this is our opportunity to invite Kisloff to give the opening lecture. And we wrote to him and said, very pleased if you come, we can pay all your expenses, airfare and everything, and hope you will join us. And we heard nothing at all until the day, or perhaps 2 days before the conference, and we then received a telex message. It was before the time of fax or email, of course. Received a telex message saying, unable to obtain British visa, regret unable to attend the conference, which was very, very sad, because we knew full well that he would have been delighted to join us, but he wasn't allowed to leave the Soviet Union. There was nothing to do with the British visa at all, I'm sure. Simply the Russians wouldn't give him permission to leave. And I'm fairly sure also that that was done by Dubinin. That was part of their battle together. And in fact, Kisloff never did leave the eastern countries, Eastern Bloc. I think he probably travelled to Czechoslovakia and 1 or 2 other eastern countries after that, but he never came to the West after that, which was very sad. I used to receive letters from him, Christmas cards every year. Every year he would write and ask, are you a grandfather yet? That's one of the jokes that we had. He'd stayed with us on several occasions, stayed in our home, and we had a great deal of respect for him as a person and a scientist, in fact. My wife liked him very much. Children liked him also. One of the things he always wanted to do when he came to England was to visit churches and cathedrals. And so we had to take him to, and this was a pleasure for us, of course, as well, to take him to places like Canterbury and Wells and Salisbury and so on. And he would remember, and then say, well, last time we went to such and such, perhaps now we could go somewhere else, which we gladly arranged. And we took him to places like Windsor Castle, for example, and it was remarkable, the knowledge that he had. There one would see portraits of the royal family at different stages, and he would know, he would say, now let me see, the wife of Charles I, now who was she? Was that Queen Henrietta? And that was the kind of conversation that we had, which was incredible, really, for a Russian to know so much about history and to be such a great scientist. So that was my memory of A.V. Kisloff. Now the other thing, or one other kind of activity that I had, I'm jumping around from one thing to another, I hope you don't mind that, but one other thing perhaps I should mention was the fact that I did have the opportunity to work closely with industry. I'd spent my 1 year with ICI, and in 1965 I was asked to undertake an ad hoc consultancy for to go to Runcorn, what was then the General Chemicals Division of ICI. And I accepted that, of course, that invitation, gladly. And that was the start, in fact, of a long relationship with ICI. And in fact, I received some things from them a few years ago, and they gave a little party for me, celebration. And I was reminded then that I was their longest serving consultant, which was a great pleasure. But this was good in a number of ways, actually. They wrote an article about me, which was entitled "The Two-Way Professor," which was a bit ambiguous, the title, but anyway, it was taken in good part. And it was good, of course, because it kept me in touch with industrial development. Much of the work, obviously, I couldn't talk about openly, but one could see the way in which things were going, need for catalysts in particular areas, the work that they were doing, for example, on inorganic fibres. I was very much concerned with that. SAFIL, as it was called, the aluminum fibres that ICI were developing in the 1970s and 80s, early 80s. the work also on high-strength cement. There was a man called Derek Birchall who was very much concerned with that. One of their star inventors, in fact, who a very interesting man who became a fellow of the Royal Society, who started professional life as literally as a technician. He had no first degree at all. He attended technical college but hadn't graduated. And he became a senior research associate of ICI, one of the few in that position, but only about half a dozen of them, received honorary degrees, honorary doctorates from various universities, and became a fellow of the Royal Society. It was an incredible achievement. And he invented, amongst other things, he invented SAFL was one of his inventions, and the macro-defect-free cement was another invention. And this was extraordinary material. It hasn't actually taken off, as far as I know, industrially, but it made the news at one stage. It was picked up by BBC, for example, and newspapers made quite a lot of this because it was possible, still is possible, to make springs out of this macro-defect-free cement, so that it behaved like a metal, in fact. Very strong material, high tensile strength, flexural strength. And the secret, in fact, was to compact material in such a way that the particles were able to come very closely together at a critical stage in the hydration process. And so the strong bonding between the hydrated cement particles. This was done by incorporation of a polymer, in fact, and reduction in porosity. We came into this in looking at the pore structure of the material at various stages. And there was a possibility at one point that it could be used in automobile engine components. But it was found, unfortunately, that although it was extremely strong up to a certain temperature, beyond that temperature it started to lose its strength. And one of the things we did was to show the way in which the porosity developed as the residual polymer was decomposed, was pyrolyzed. And so that was a problem. And I don't know whether that has been solved. I don't know the status. But I doubt whether ICI have continued that work. I'm afraid that's one of the things that probably been sacrificed by the accountants who go around many of these large companies. And so I benefited very much from this experience of working with industry, and of course it also gave my students a chance to undertake industrial projects, and in some cases also to get employment in industry. So it's very much a two-way process. In fact, that one had the opportunity to have the long-term relationship, because that's what I had with the ICI company, not simply a one-off consultancy. I feel that it's a pity that many of these large firms are reluctant to employ young academics as consultants. They prefer to go for people who already sort of made a name for themselves, and that's okay, but maybe they don't trust some of the youngsters. This might be part of the problem. But I think it is regrettable because the new ideas are coming, of course, from younger scientists and with a lot of enthusiasm. And given the chance, they can contribute, I think, a great deal to industry, young academics. So, now, Burt, is this a point just to where you would like to take me at this point?
Could you describe the history of the Gregg balance and why he developed it?
Yes, okay. Yes, the Gregg balance. Well, now, the thing about that was that going back to the early days of absorption measurements, of of course, it's well known that one can either measure the increase in mass of the adsorbent, or you can measure the reduction in volume of the adsorbing gas, one way or the other. Now, these were the two long-established principles of measuring adsorption, that is, by the gravimetric type of procedure of some sort, or by what we used to call, we don't call it that now, but either by that or a volumetric procedure. And there was in the period around, let me think, the late 1920s, early 30s, there was a development by McBain of the spring balance, the McBain-Backer spring balance. This was well known. In fact, we used it for many studies, very useful thing. But wasn't altogether an elegant device. It was a direct type of measurement, but there were several disadvantages. Of course, there was a need to ensure that one corrected, if necessary, one corrected for buoyancy. The working range of the balance was restricted. You had, of course, to ensure that you had a spring that behaved elastically, obeyed Hooke's law, which you could achieve with a fused quartz spring. That's the type of spring that we employ. But the working range was necessarily limited, so you had to work within the constraints of a maximum loading, and that meant that you had available a working range and a maximum amount of adsorbent that you could use. Now, the alternative at that stage, those early days, was to actually interrupt the adsorption measurement and detach what we call the adsorbent bulb, close the tap leading to the adsorbent and detach that from the adsorption rig, and to weigh that and follow the change in weight of that. Now that's a very tedious, time-consuming, cumbersome sort of procedure, of course. It couldn't possibly give you very accurate results. So Greg had the idea, which was a very good one, I think, that one could, in principle, measure the adsorption in situ by using a beam balance. And this is what he constructed. So it was a glass beam balance. The pivots were actually gramophone needles in the early days. And we had hang-down wires on the two sides. On one side, the adsorbent would be suspended, and on the other side, there was a solenoid contained inside a glass envelope, sealed up inside the glass envelope, and we had an electromagnet outside the balance case. So it was a simple principle procedure that one would adjust the current outside the electromagnet until one achieved the null position of the balance beam, and in that way you would then register the change in weight, having calibrated, of course, against known difference in mass in place of an adsorbent. So it's a very simple and direct idea, very neat one, very novel idea. As far as I know, no one else had actually thought about it in this way. It's been superseded, of course, now by the microbalances which are now available. But it was probably the first of its kind. Now, the trouble, unfortunately, in practice was that it would tend to drift, that the position of the supports would change with time, and the thing then, it was very difficult, almost impossible, in fact, to know whether there was a genuine change in mass of the adsorbent, continuous change in mass of the adsorbent, or whether it was a spurious effect. The balance itself was giving some sort of drift, which you would pick up. And so what we had to do, in fact, was to improve the suspensions. We had to restrict the movement of the balance, to improve the electrical systems and so on. This is what we did in the old days, and we made it workable. But, and Greg later actually also put in an auto recording device. He worked with an electrical engineer, a man called Wintle, and that was also partially successful. But I think really, looking back, the whole thing was probably ahead of its time, I suspect. We didn't have the technology available in those days. That was just after World War II, to effect the improvements required to make it workable. And so it was superseded inevitably by these other types of balance. And now, of course, one uses the commercial type of microbalance. Again, one has to be very careful, of course, about this, because in some cases they are susceptible to corrosion attack and so on. And you have to be careful about the measurements at high pressures, the problems that are still with us, temperature gradients across from a cryostat bath, say, or from high temperature furnace across to the sample itself. Sample, if you're making measurements at some temperatures away from ambient temperature of the adsorbent is never exactly the same as the temperature of the ceramics. One has to be aware of that, and to make corrections or to make calibrations for that. So, but that's the way in which it started.
Now, the Fischer-Tropsch products, were those from the British coal research effort, or was it from another source?
It was probably from another source, I suspect. ICI were interested. That was the time when the early stages of the petrochemical industry, of course, were also developing. In fact, the work that we were doing was incorporated a little later in research at the so-called Wilton Research Station on the River Tees in the north of England. And so it was superseded by petrochemicals research. But the options were kept open at that point. So I really don't know about the actual origin of the Fischer-Tropsch products, because that wasn't within my own remit. So I'm not sure about that. But I think it was probably to do with the ICI own research areas rather than British coal, I think, at that stage. I would guess.
Now, it was implied to me recently that Boriskov at Novosibirsk had, I guess, caused a number of his potential competitors to disappear from. Are you aware of any of the Russian that operated that way, or?
Yes, well, that's a very interesting question. I'm not directly aware of anyone who fell victim to Boriskov in particular. I didn't visit Novosibirsk in his time. He was, as far as I know, the first director of the famous Catalysis Institute in Novosibirsk. And I'd met him briefly. I remember him at Catalysis meetings. And there was one man, actually, who was a very dynamic character called Voevodsky. Now, Voevodsky, in fact, he was a very bouncy and confident, perhaps overconfident Russian, who disagreed with Turkovich, in fact. These two were, I'm just trying to think which conference that was. It was probably one around 1965 or something like that, I would guess. But I can't be, it was in the 1960s, so I can't be sure which conference it was. But there was a very strong argument between Voevodsky and Turkovich, I remember, on one occasion. And Voevodsky seemed to be one of the, what you might call the blue-eyed boy of Boleskov seemed certainly to be favoured and to be going places. And then suddenly he didn't appear anymore. Now, what happened to him, I don't know. Whether he died, whether he was relegated, whether he was demoted or moved out of the lab for some reason, I have no idea. But the interesting question you've raised, actually, because certainly Voevodsky was a man who, at one stage, was very well known and seemed to be a prominent member of Boleskov's group, and then didn't contribute after that. Now, why, I don't know. I knew the man who replaced Boleskov was called Zamarayev. And I knew him very well because he was a prominent member of the IUPAC. In fact, he became president of the IUPAC. And when I went to Novosibirsk in 1989, I think that must have been, round about that time anyway, was my visit to Novosibirsk. I spent a week there, and he was then director, was in a very important position certainly, but was finding life increasingly difficult because of course these institutes in Novosibirsk had been favoured by special, they were the centres of excellence in the old Soviet Union, and they were highly privileged. I mean, their life was interesting in a way there because the distance was so great from Moscow. It took, 4 hours or so to fly there from Moscow, I remember. And they seemed to be so isolated, and yet the scientists who were working there considered themselves to be highly favoured. There's no doubt about that. And they were given good facilities in the old days. And then, as conditions deteriorated in the Soviet Union, life became more and more difficult. And now it must be very difficult indeed. I have no idea how they're living now, but they must have a very tough life, I would think. I knew several of them quite well because they had contributed to physical absorption, study of porous materials, and some of them were able to travel quite freely at one stage. In fact, I was certainly impressed by the work that they were doing. I mean, this was an enormous institute. In fact, I think it was claimed to be the biggest catalysis institute in the world. There's no doubt they were doing some good work, excellent work. But when I was there, they were then talking about problems that they had. They couldn't get computers. It was a stage when it was so important, of course, to upgrade the instrumentation. And this was one of their problems. And they felt also that they were isolated. I remember one of them telling me that he had to go to Moscow to get parts for his motor car, this kind of thing. The local suppliers. I went round the local shop in the hotel. They had a kind of hotel attached to the institute, which was all right. But the shop there was extraordinary. I mean, they had just one style of suit, a men's suit on sale, for example, one type of shirt that you could buy, and that was it. No choice at all. And so there were a lot of shelves that were completely bare, and then every so often they would bring out a new product of some sort, and then people would dash, and so the word would get around, something new to buy. But on the other hand, they had a great range of things like gramophone records in the old days. I bought several very cheap gramophone records there, which I brought back. And they had a lot of cultural activities. I remember being taken to the opera house in the town of Novosibirsk and so on. And I was taken to somebody's dasha also, which was quite nice, in fact, even in winter time. So it was a different way of life, but one that had to be properly maintained, properly sustained. And they had been privileged, and then that privilege was removed. I think this is what happened. It was great.
Now, did you get involved in polywater controversy?
Very interesting, polywater. Well, I wouldn't say I was involved, but I did have some experience of getting to know a little bit about what was going on. Yes, we held a meeting in Wales, actually, in I'm just trying to think of the year. I would guess now it was 1968, but that's a guess. This was a European meeting, and we had the opportunity to invite a number of people. Kisloff was there, for example. He came to that meeting, and Derryagin came. It was just at the time when we were beginning to get the first information about polywater. And so we invited, we were intrigued about this, of course, about the story of polywater. It was a mystery at that stage. And so we invited Derryagin, and he gave quite an impressive presentation. And I remember in the discussion, Everett was there, and he was reserved about it. As always, Douglas Everett is cautious, a very good scientist, and was reserved about it, not prepared to commit himself one way or the other. There were some scientists, on the other hand, who were extremely enthusiastic about it, as a matter of fact. There was one, I better not mention his name, but one spectroscopist who was completely sold on the idea. There were others, I remember Frank, the American, was very dubious about it. He said, well, look, if this is true, we've got to develop a whole new theoretical concept, and I can't accept it at face value. And that was the situation at that stage. And then I heard, a little bit after that, there was a man, you may well know him, Brian Pesiger, who was head of Unilever Research Laboratory in Britain. And he, in fact, went off to Moscow and brought back what was claimed to be a tube with the polywater in it. And unfortunately, it was a great pity, because this got into the national press, and it was publicized as being the first polywater in Europe, and all this guy in England and so on. He was photographed with this, and of course it was complete nonsense, actually. And probably, I suspect, it may well have ruined his career, or contributed at least to his downfall in Unilever, because Pesiger left, I don't say required to leave, but he left Unilever not too long after that, in fact, and moved here to the United States. So, and then, of course, the tale unfolded, and Derryagin had to make public the fact that a mistake had been made. It was a great tragedy for him, there's no doubt, because Derryagin had been regarded, and I think rightly so, as a very fine scientist. And he had a lot of original ideas, and did some very good pioneering work in surface column chemistry. His work still quoted, of course. And then it just happened that he was deluded. His co-workers really let him down, but he fell for it. This was the mistake that he made. He fell for it, and thought that he'd made some major discovery, which of course turned out to be completely wrong. So it was a very interesting story altogether, a human story, which showed the fact that I think that human beings are, that scientists are human beings, science is a human activity. Very good example of that, it seems to me.
Well, that's all the questions I have.
All right, okay, fine. Okay?
Okay.